So it's like, how fast can we accelerate on Mondays? What's our top speed on Wednesdays? And then what's our highest deceleration capabilities on Fridays? Because then we were able to compare how fast can you run through that gate on a Monday when you just get to run? And then how close to that time can you be when you know you have to stop?
That was Joel Reinhardt, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. If you're in the world of sports performance, you've probably heard of jump testing mats. These mats use hang time to measure total jump height or contact time to measure quickness abilities off of the ground. The best jump mat that I've come across also happens to be a sponsor of this show, which is the Plyomat. The Plyomat is not only accurate, easy to use, and affordable, but it also allows you to string multiple mats together to add an extra dynamic to plyometric testing and training. To check out the Plyomat, you can head to plyomat.net. That's plyomat.net. Welcome to another episode of the podcast, and thanks for tuning in. This week's guest is Joel Reinhardt. It's great to welcome him back to the show. He is an assistant athletic performance coach and sports science coordinator for San Jose State football. Joel has extensive experience from his previous roles at Stanford, UMass, and Nicholls State. I've enjoyed his previous appearances on the show. He has that knowledge of sports science and that data-based workload end of the equation, and he also has a great intuition for practical sports performance principles. On today's show, he'll be talking about multilateral speed training, game speed, deceleration, weekly training workouts, and much more. It was great catching up with Joel, and I know you guys will love this episode. Let's get to it here, 422 with Joel Reinhardt. Joel, it's great to have you back on the show here. I know you're in relatively the same, but some things have changed with the new role you have at San Jose State. What's been new in the last few years for you and the job position you're in now?
Yeah, thanks for having me on again, Joel. Yeah, at San Jose, I still run all the tech we've got, and kind of the front end planning of that, looking at how practice flows with the head coach and the coordinator and whatnot. But then my main kind of performance side role is all the field work and all the weight room work for the wideouts and DBs. So that's been a lot of fun because just the dudes who, it's like, all right, how can we, it's kind of not a singular focus because there's a lot going on in football, but it's a very narrowed focus of just like, how fast can we go in all these different directions and scenarios. And that's pretty much it, which is fun to kind of hone in on. Because obviously there's other stuff that goes on in the football realm, how the linemen got to move bodies and all that. But like, I'm not as, one of the other strength coaches, that's his main focus. So I get to really dial in on just like, all right, let's move fast and get ready for the diabolically high volume that inevitably comes with camp, while still maintaining all these performance qualities. So that's been a fun thing to dive in on. So.
Yeah, we had just mentioned this a little bit before, how fast, especially with the game speed and agility, I think things are evolving very fast in the world of football prep. And with the situation with that, where you have that population, I think of it like track. You got the throws coach who does the throws practice and probably, unless the strength coach does the weights for throws, and then you got the sprints coach who does sprints practice and the weights for sprinting, and and so on and so forth. And is that common where one coach, performance coach, will have a group and then do both the field and the weights for them, kind of like that track model? Or just from what I have seen, at least in the past, was you have maybe one person is writing the weights for a greater group, and then there's, I don't know. I'm just curious how that breaks down and how that.
Yeah, some staff changed. Definitely do it different. I've been on staffs that do it differently. It's just the way head strength coach here is new to VC, and he's great. I mean, it's been awesome in terms of delegation and autonomy that we get. But it's we kind of meet to go over the big picture schedule and how much field time do we want versus weight room time, and days like themes of the days of the week. But then past that, it's just like, all right, do your thing with your group, which is I like it. There are definitely give and takes to every scenario. I like this one because it's I get to just dial in on these guys. There's definitely I get to have my hand along with everybody too, because I got the kind of broader sports science stuff as well. So But if I didn't, definitely have to be more intentional about like, saying what's up to the linemen more because I don't
Hmm.
really work with them as much during training, but some little things like that. But no, I think it is nice because you do get just like the full holistic picture of what's going on. Um, but it ends up working out either way. I mean, I've
Yeah.
had places where it's like one guy's kind of writing most of the field work for all the groups, and then maybe the weight room is split up, but then everybody's meeting to go over everything anyway. So it doesn't end up being as, you know, um, as like you don't have days where it's just like, oh, we thought it was a top speed day or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, the day before you heavy squatted, like you end up meeting about everything. So that doesn't really end up happening. But it is definitely nice to kind of like if the way we have it set up now, like even like on the fly day to day, I'm able to kind of monitor both with the tech, but then also just like conversations I have with the guys and watching them move. I can be, I have like a handful of our guys who I know really take care of themselves and really sleep well and really eat well. And they're kind of my, canary in the coal mine type guys where if I've got a couple of our guys who I know maybe aren't taking care of themselves as well, and they're like, I'm sore or whatever, I'm like, all right. I go to like our main dudes, and I'm like, how do you feel?
Mm.
And if they're like, yeah, I'm feeling a little bit, and it's like, all right, that gives me a data point of like, how do I need to adjust or whatnot. But having that just be my group, I'm able to like a lot easier on the fly adjust with them, which has been it's been good.
Yeah, I'm sure there's pros and cons with any
Yeah,
setup, but and especially like you mentioned, maybe more what I would assume a traditional setup would be is like you said, there's a guy writing the weights, and then there's maybe a coach who's doing the field stuff, and as long
yeah,
as the communication is very very good, that can absolutely work out. But at the same time, like I mentioned, track and field, there's just something with the intuition of you're writing the weights for your group, then you're seeing how they're moving on the field. So you're always seeing that feedback loop. It's not just something you're talking about or even seeing a number, like you're physically coaching it and
yeah,
witnessing it. And then for you, you're doing the sports science on top of that. So it's almost like what a track coach might be doing, but then you have the additional like the data collection, which obviously track coaches certainly collect data, but as far as I know, the data you're getting in football likely exceeds a lot of the data, even for a track coach. And so, it's just interesting that you have that complete feedback loop. And I think there's definitely something that, I mean, to me, that seems like a really great way to set it up.
yeah. It's been good, and like I'm able to, even like sending out like broader reports to the other coaches and that sort of thing. But even the level of detail that I've been able to have like individual chats with some of the skill guys about because, I've got basically, 15 wideouts, 15 DBs, give or take. I essentially have 30 in my group. So I'm able to, you know, oh, I saw so and so, hit this threshold that we don't like seeing or something like, whatever. I have plenty of time to like have individual chats with these dudes, whether it's warm up before the session or they're chilling in the training room or something like that. So it's not like, oh, I gotta try to have the individual chats with these 90 dudes.
Hmm.
It's like, 25, 30 guys, which it's been nice.
Yeah, to have those like bellwethers or I think like you said, canary in a coal mine that can just help. Yeah, when you have 90, I'm sure there has to be like those little heuristics and those little like, okay, if this
Yeah, for
population
sure.
is doing this, then that's a good reflection of everything else. Uh,
Yeah. I've got like two dudes where I know if they tell me their hamstrings are feeling it, I know we're probably pushing it on the high speed volume. But if they're like, nah, I feel good, then I'm like, all right, we can keep building.
Yeah. So you had mentioned, with the monitoring side too. I know when you were at Stanford, your role was more of the sports science and monitoring. And so I'm
Mhm.
curious, and we talked like weekly layouts and how the week unfolds from that workloads perspective. Now that you have a greater role in writing this, I mean, I know you're doing more of the quarterbacks and like kicking or special groups last time.
Yeah.
Now that you have a greater group, you're doing more. Tell me a little bit, maybe just go into some of those ideas that came out of the sports science and the workloads now that it's all practical on field in the weight room.
Yeah. So, and this is one thing I try to communicate this as well as possible with the guys is, you know, with just like the workloads of camp and knowing like, looking at our numbers from last year and then knowing what the scripts are from I've already seen the scripts for the first 5 days of training camp, first couple weeks of training camp. So I know how long those practices are, how many team reps they're taking, all that. So we, can reasonably predict what they're going to see. And so then it was, okay, we need to build up to X percentage of that in summer two. Because we had our summer this year was 4 weeks, 4th of July week off, and then 3 weeks, and then camp. And we're in the back half of that third week right now. And we're going immediately into camp. Like our last day of training is Friday, and then we have meetings on Monday, and we have practice Tuesday. So there isn't really a ton of downtime. So I knew that this week that we're currently in, I would want to taper a little bit so they feel decent next week. So really last week was our highest volume week of the whole summer. So for me, it was like just looking at the summer from a big picture standpoint and then going into the weeks, like how the weeks would flow. It was almost treating summer two as in season and I was telling the guys like, we're still tracking speeds. We're still hitting some fly tens. Like we do some accelerate. We get some timed accelerations. I was like, but I don't like in summer one, the overall volume that we had to put on them was still low enough as we were building up coming back from that May break, where, guys' speeds pretty much got faster every week. That last week before they went away for 4th of July was, the fastest speeds that we saw. And then coming in back for summer two, it was kind of like my mindset from a performance metric standpoint was more in season in terms of like, hey, I want these guys hitting, ideally 90, 95 plus once, twice a week. Cool. But like, I'm putting so much volume on you. I don't necessarily expect you to keep PRing fly 10 every week because, like last week, the skill guys had 25,000 total yards on them. And just the way we're ebbing and flowing throughout the week, I guess I can get into that. So summer one, it was like Monday, Wednesday, Friday are our true high days on the field and in the weight room. Tuesday, Thursday were very truly like low. Still decently high volume, but truly low in that summer one. So when we were doing Excel work on Mondays, Tuesday was, true extensive work. So they felt pretty good coming into Wednesday. They had a little bit of volume on their legs from Monday, Tuesday, but Tuesday is truly extensive. So they were set up pretty well on Wednesday to like truly get after it in terms of absolute speeds. And just that was much more open environments on those days. And so they would feel great. Numbers looked amazing. And then so the difference in summer two was that Tuesday ended up being kind of a medium-ish. We had some extensive tempo work on that day, but then we also started working in more technical tactical work with we're allowed because of the hours we're allowed to have a couple hours with the coaches. And so we kept it, talking with our offensive coordinator, we're able to cycle some of the technical tactical work. So some of it is with the coaches and some of it is just player run to, because we have the hours limits or whatever. So on in the summer too, Monday, Wednesday, Friday still are true high days where I'm like, hey, I need you to be ready to run full speed. And we're gonna try to set you up as much for success as possible. Where we'd have the high day work with us on the field, and then they'd go right into football work, and we intentionally would script that to be much more open field. Receivers getting downfield more, that sort of work. And then the Tuesday, Thursday, they still had football work, so they're, it's different than summer one that was truly extensive on the Tuesday, Thursday. Like, hey, summer two, Tuesday, Thursday, you're gonna have moments where you need to run full speed. You're gonna be lined up, and it might be we intentionally kept that much shorter. The route stuff they were doing with the quarterbacks, like the wideouts, it was more. We do it in the red zone or in the goal line area, shorter routes. So broad strokes, if you just looked at our days and our weeks in the summer too, like they had essentially 5 high days in a row. But Monday, Wednesday, Friday was much more open field, lots of high speed yards. And the Tuesday, Thursday was a lot higher acceleration, deceleration stuff. And then but then the bulk of their volume still on the Tuesday, Thursday was extensive work at the end of their football work. So it wasn't, we didn't have like, so the barometer for me on that Wednesday was no longer like, oh, they feel good, they're set up for success. But, these guys are PRing every week, both, the instantaneous from the GPS and then the average from the fly tens or whatever. But it was like, all right, we're within 90, 95. Everybody's kind of, showing up green on my dashboards there. It's like, all right, cool. We're still good there. And I communicated that with the guys in terms of, thinking ahead to fall camp. I was like laying out the week. I'm like, hey, in June, I was setting you up for success. Now we're not putting you in a bad spot right now, but if you're not personally, locked in and accountable to sleeping well, eating well, taking care of your body on these, in the little time in between sessions, like you might not feel great for Wednesday, but if you're intentional about doing that sort of thing, then you'll feel good. And I think the guys appreciated like having to feel that rhythm because in fall camp, we're going to go, Sundays are going to be off. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, practice. Thursday is going to be just walkthrough. And then Friday, Saturday, we practice hard again. So it's really off, 3 on, off, 2 on, off. And we cycle like that. And so there's going to be, in that 3 day in a row cycle in fall camp, that Wednesday prior to the Thursday just walkthrough, like that's going to be one of our higher volume practices. It's going to be a lot of just playing football. And later in camp, it's going to be very scrimmagey. And so it's like, hey, you're going to have 2 days under your belt before you, Monday and Tuesday, but you're going to be expected to truly perform and like win jobs on that Wednesday. And so, giving you these 3 weeks of summer too, to kind of feel out what works for you in terms of helping your body out to feel good on that third day. For the summer, it was feel good to run fast and show me some absolute outputs. And then, but feeling that rhythm so that in fall camp, you know how to help yourself out. So on that third day, you're ready to still go out and really perform. So, yeah.
Yeah, I like having, compared to track and field, which I think in some ways it's, or maybe not in some ways, there's less factors in a singular track event than there is a team football environment, and the practice workloads and the tactics and kind of the variability of it too, just because when you're playing, there's going to be a lot more it's not going to be like the coaches aren't going to be like, okay, we're going to run this many yards exactly, and after that we stop, and it's in this many sets and reps, and it's all clean cut. It's like, it's a lot more variable, and there's more chaos. But it's with, like you said, the dashboards and tracking adaptation to the chaos. It's very interesting. I think whether it's team sports or track, I think there's a lot to be learned, just because I do think one of the things that I've always been interested in is how do athletes tolerate high volume training, where if it would be a workload where you typically would think, wow, this would destroy somebody, or this is too much based off of maybe other workloads you've seen, being able to find ways to manage that. Even what you were mentioning, going from summer one training where it's like, you could say Charlie Francis style, you got 3 high days a week and 2 low days is pretty straightforward. But then, all right, now we're in summer 2, and now it's a high day, a medium day, and a really intense day. And how do you, like the art of adapting to that, I think is really interesting. But I'm sure there's also that seasonal piece where you can kind of push things for any time, like any time you can push it. But at some point you have to let off the gas. I think that's a big factor too. It's almost like athletes can do anything. It's just how long can they do anything for in some ways.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And even too, like when I originally was putting together the summer, and I was thinking like, all right, we've got 3 weeks to build into, on that backside of 4th of July. We got 3 weeks to keep cranking up the volume so that they're, within striking distance of that first week of camp. And then as I started thinking about it more, I was like, they have pretty quick turnaround to camp. So like, I probably want that last week to be a little bit of a peel back. So then I kind of adjusted things up a little bit to be like, no, that second to last week is going to be our highest volume, so that we can kind of undulate a little bit into that first camp week, just to set them up a little bit there. But it's funny. So I posted on Instagram just like what our layout was in summer 1, And Dwayne Bradshaw, he was the head guy at Washington State. He's at Exos now. He DM'd me about it, and we were having a little bit of back and forth. And one of the questions he asked me was like, do you think having like not having them run full speed at all on back-to-back days, like having it be true high-low, is like, do you think that's getting them ready for camp? And then that we were talking about like, oh, I'm going to adjust it in summer too. And he was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, so, but it was funny. Like somebody who's been around a lot of football, he immediately was like, hey, his bells went off of, these guys need to be ready to run, even if you can undulate practice structures and like environments enough, it's like, they're still going to be asked to run at least one or, a handful of reps lined up full speed and crank it up several days in a row. So even if you can have generally lower and higher days, but you're still going to have to crank it up every day, which is, what we shot for in this summer 2 zone was like, yeah, if you purely no context, just looked at like the outputs that are coming out from the GPS, you'd be like, oh, these are 5 high days in a row. Or like the Tuesday, Thursday looks a little bit more medium just because it's shorter environments. So the absolute velocities are typically in the kind of 82 to 87 range. They're nothing like nobody's really touching 90 on those days. But if you actually came out and watched it, it'd be like, oh, that medium work is a lot of just like positional, it's like indie practice. And then, so it's not like the guys don't feel dead. They're a lot more resilient than you think when you just lead them into it. Yeah. Which is like, I mean, part of that is the fall camp stuff too, is like, yes, there's a side of it of like, oftentimes football coaches want to go bananas. And so we need to help them have a semblance of a, solid, somewhat undulating plan during fall camp. But then it's also like sometimes you can get gun shy on the backside of the summer because there's the thought process of just like, well, if the coach, because all football coaches, pretty much every university around, the football coaches are on vacation in July. But they still get those injury reports every Friday or every day or whatever. So it's like, oh, I don't want my wide receivers coach to see on the injury report that, Johnny's hamstring is sore and it's the last week of July. It's like, what? So I feel like sometimes even though you're getting ready for camp, sometimes there's almost like too much of a taper sometimes. It's just like, let's get everybody to the starting line, which obviously you want to do. But I've used this analogy before, but it's like the summer 2 is a controlled burn, and it can be scary sometimes because, if you don't do a controlled burn, the, fall camp ends up being a true forest fire that, burns down houses and whatnot, and then everybody's injured. Or you can do the opposite and go a little too crazy during fall camp or during summer 2, and then guys don't make it to the starting line.
Yeah.
But it's that happy medium of like really pushing it, but then it's still a little intimidating as a performance coach because you still have to light stuff on fire to do a controlled burn. But it's just like, setting the parameters and digging the ditches beforehand so you know where it's going to stop and that sort of stuff. But then also, being malleable along the way. But it's, I would say a big thing I've taken out of this of kind of adjusting some of the summer 2 stuff is like, as long as you lead into it, like these guys are resilient. They're going to be okay. And you still have some semblance of, you still have a goal in your head of avoiding monotony, just from both a general output standpoint, but then also just like an environment standpoint, like what they're seeing on the field. Like if you avoid monotony and have a nice build up into it, like they can handle a lot.
Today's podcast is sponsored by the Athletic Development Games educational program. This program includes a video library of fun and engaging games aimed at kids ages 4 to 10 years old. In the program, you'll find activities for speed, coordination, jumping, and more, with new videos added each month. The games are fun, engaging, and they also invoke the imagination. It's given me great ideas already for my youth sports teams, as well as plenty of games to play with my own children. To sign up for the course, you can head to athleticdevelopmentgames.com/app, and you can use the coupon code JUSTFLY, that's JUSTFLY with all caps, at checkout for an exclusive 50% off. Yeah. Athletes, certainly like I mentioned, their ability to tolerate, if you do it right, can be substantial. I think it can be surprising in many ways. I like the control burn idea. Would you say like the not doing enough edge of that would be if the athletes like are all in green every day? Like everybody's always in green, we're always good. Like you're never pushing people to those yellows and reds occasionally. Would that be kind of what you're saying with that?
Yeah, and just like in order to like, I say, with the constraints we have on time, like we have to give them 2 days off. So we only get 5 days of training in the summer. In order to fit the volumes in those 5 days that you need to get ready for camp, like you're gonna have to be we're gonna be asking these dudes to be running full speed and giving full effort on days when they don't necessarily feel great. And that can be intimidating sometimes, but a lot of it is education with the guys, like being intentional about certain soft tissue modalities to help them feel good. I know I've got a handful of guys who I know, if they're not intentional about their certain hip stuff, then they get, their kind of classic right side is dumped a little more forward, and then they get the hit. So it's like, sending him the extra text to be like, hey, get here 30 minutes earlier. I'll help you with your hip stuff. Just like, you basically have to crank up everything around it to help make sure they're able to handle it. Yeah, it's like they'll adapt. They're going to be okay, but it's just part of it is educating the guys too. And it's because they truly were like, they felt great on those high days in summer one. And now it's like, if I'm not educating them about what the shift in the plan is, and all of a sudden they get to that Wednesday where typically they felt great, and now they're like, my hips are a little sore. It's like, just give them the bigger picture to help them kind of plan around it.
Yeah, back to the templates. I thought this was interesting, is you talked about summer one and summer two, and I want to dig into that from, I guess maybe you could say a little bit of a universal, like just speed and power training perspective. I heard this was probably in the late 2010s. I was reading up on something where, and it's just interesting to think too of like the formation of strength and conditioning, athletic performance, and common weekly templates and how people do things. And I forget what writer this was, but he had said something about that he had gotten better results. And again, I also like, before I'll preface this with saying I like seasonal blocks. Like I like one block being fundamentally and structurally different than the other. I like, for the sake of avoiding monotony, but I also think just throughout the season. But he was saying that switching away from, and this was coming out of, I think, the West Side, where West Side dominated everyone's program. You have two max effort, the max effort, lower and upper, dynamic, lower, upper, and those things. And I think before it was kind of like, okay, you get your 2 lower max days. So it was 2 linear type and COD. All the speed was in those 2 days on the week, maybe Monday, Thursday or something, or Tuesday, Friday or whatever. And whoever had written this was saying, well, I got a lot better results when I switched it to 2 linear speed days and then 2 COD days. And that's a lot of it. That's a lot of, many times my templates do break down into that on some level, just because you had said, like, even too, with like the volumes, the way that variability works, even in COD, I feel like there's so much variability and degrees of freedom with how the body solves that problem, especially if it's variable and there's different outcomes. I think you can do a lot of it. And I think it actually complements linear sprinting extremely well. And so I was curious how maybe how does that break down in summer one? Or maybe does summer one just run more like track and field, and then that's the season of that, and then you have summer two, and then there's more COD. Yeah, I'm just curious of the interplay between those two, because that is something that's fascinating to me, both from a athletic prep coaching hat, but also the track coaching hat, because it is funny in track and field. I'd seen people do COD actually over a decade ago in track, and I was like, oh, that's cool variability. But now I'm like, yeah, that's like really like in general prep phases. To me, that's unless you're playing like ultimate frisbee or games, to me that's almost essential just from multilateral perspective. I'll stop rambling and
Yeah.
let you answer the question.
No, I mean, you've even talked about it before with like, seeing a high jumper who played a little basketball and he comes back and he's jumping higher, without even really jumping much, just because getting that variability on the ankle and whatnot. But no, so in the summer one and the general themes have stayed similar in summer two, but that the Monday is do a lot of acceleration work, and our change of direction work was focused on angles. I'm losing if I'm acute or obtuse here. Whatever. On my 8th grade math teacher will be mad at me. But angles more in front of you than 90 degrees. So just like linear, 45-degree changes, 90-degree change. Like we kept most of the changes of direction in front of you. And then the Wednesdays, the nonlinear work was more curve and like maneuverability type stuff. And then the Fridays was sharper angles, like having to go back behind you sharper than 90 degrees. So that was kind of the general layout. But then the other thing that I guess differed from that general template was on the Fridays. So one thing we did every Monday in summer one, and we kept it in the first 2 weeks of summer two, was we tracked acceleration. So every week I got a 10-yard, and then we would do 2 reps. One of them was a 10-yard, and one of them, the distance varied. So it went 15, 20, went out to 10, 15, 20. So then I had a 10 every week, and I had a 10, 15, and 20 from summer one, and 10, 15, 20 from summer two. But whichever the longer distance that we timed on Monday, we did that same distance timed on Friday, but it was that distance timed and you had to decelerate within 5 yards after it. So it was, the only exception for that was when we went out to 25 yards, I bumped it to 7 yards decel zone, because hauling ass through a 25-yard laser and then decelling in 5 is a lot. So even doing like when they were at full speed through 20-yard laser and then decelling in 5, like those, like I felt like we were getting their true max deceleration. And that's what I was shooting for, was like making sure these guys are having to touch in the same way that it's like, hey, I want you to hit 90 plus or 95 plus of your max speed, once or twice a week. And we're really shooting for it on those Wednesdays. Like the Fridays were almost, can we get within that same percentage of the fastest that you can decelerate? So it's like, how fast can we accelerate on Mondays? What's our top speed on Wednesdays? And then what's our highest deceleration capabilities on Fridays? Because then we were able to compare how fast can you run through that gate on a Monday when you just get to run? And then how close to that time can you be when you know you have to stop? And so it was pushing the guys to like, and you'd see some guys would do a rep and they'd get hesitant and you could see their body language change 2 yards before the laser. So their time was trash. And it's like, do you see? And then even they would immediately be like, I pulled up, like, dang. And so they're like, then the next rep, they try to push it a little more. So the deceleration outputs we saw in those days were, it's crazy high in terms of their own capabilities. And because, deceleration isn't necessarily something you can truly overload outside of being towed. And even that's like kind of dicey, and it would be weird to, I'm towing you super maximally and then having you shut down, it is not logistically feasible, I would say that. So it's like the closest we can get to quote unquote overloading your deceleration capabilities is just making sure that the lead-in zone is truly as fast as you can possibly go. And so having the laser be compared to that Monday was helpful. And so we saw a lot of value there. And so the shift from 1 to 2 was we kept those same themes. We had 4 weeks of summer one, and the first 2 weeks was fairly closed. We were coming off, they had 4 weeks off. So we started sprinkling a little bit of some open stuff. But then the last 2 weeks of summer one was almost all open. And then we were able to take those drills that we finished summer one with and then just add some complexity, whether that was number of players involved in the environments, the, overall area available to them, just little things like that. I mean, some of it was literally just like now the offender, the offensive guy gets to have a football in his hands because we're, we now have that available to us. NCAA gets weird of like when a football comes out, all of a sudden it becomes different countable time or whatever.
Yeah.
But we had some of that time available to us, so we're able to toss a football in there. So that was kind of the overall progression. The themes of the days stayed consistent, and you saw that in the open environments that we saw. Like one of the drills, we did it today, was on this like our higher speed day where we're trying to work maneuverability and the nonlinear work was, it's essentially just puts them in a scenario where you got two defenders and, they have to go around a cone to start. So it's, I can send you a video of it too, but
Sure,
it's,
I can put it in show notes as well.
Yeah. But it basically ends up just being like the best way put them in an environment where, hey, the end zone is 25 yards away. So you gotta, you get a fair amount of space, but just put them in a scenario where the easiest way for the offender to go score is kind of curving around this defender a little bit. And, so it's just putting them in, trying to put them in a scenario without having them think about it.
Yeah.
And then like the Monday stuff, just having it be scenarios where we know just based on what is going to win the rep, you're probably going to end up having a handful of little starts and stops that go along with it. Cool. And then the Fridays was, putting them in an environment where they had to, the best way to win the rep was to be at, to end up doing something at a fairly sharp angle. So, and of course there ends up being reps where they don't do that because they figure out some other way to do it. And then I go, oh, cool. I didn't actually think of that's, but that's okay because they're just being creative and trying to do stuff. But yeah, so the overall theme stayed similar, but it just progressed to more open across the summer. And I got it. So that was when I was working on the summer during spring ball. I read Joey G did a series of articles for Simply Faster last year, a couple of years ago, something like that, talking about how he just how he kind of organized and built out his more open environments. And it kind of, I'd included it in the past and whatever, but that definitely kind of jolted me to be like being a lot more organized with the slight progressions of throughout the summer. And there were a couple of those drills where the progression that I had built out in the spring, the middle stop in the progression, because they were doing so well, I just threw it out and we went to the last step because they were ahead of schedule or whatever. But it was definitely nice to kind of big picture see the progression and kind of play around with the drills ourselves too, to kind of like, all right, I can say, here's what I want you to do in this drill, but if the best way to win the drill is some other way, that's what they're going to do because the goal is still just to win, cross the goal line before you get tagged or whatever. So, and if you realize, if you realize the best way to win the drill is not necessarily the physical output that you wanted, like not adjusting by putting more constraints on the drill to make it look the way you want. It's like, no, you just need to find a better drill or find not better, but a different drill that, influences them into the outputs that you want.
Yeah. Yeah. I like thinking of how, to me, the variability of play and sport, it's like magic. It just the way it ignites an athlete, the nervous system, all the pathways. And I know I have found, I know a lot of other coaches have found this the best way to warm up for like a 20-meter sprint or anything like that. It's play a game, do something dynamic that's a game. And there's just something about that. And I was looking, actually, I drew your, the Monday, the summer one. I have like these shapes on the Monday, Wednesday, Friday, because I like kind of, I don't know, I like drawing a lot. And I like
Yeah.
seeing Monday, you have the oblique angle. And then Wednesday, it's like a curve, a linear. And then there's like a sharp decel on Friday. And I love, by the way, that sharp decel. It's like a eccentric overload, right? So you'd want to get that extra day of rest after the eccentric. So that makes sense. But I was thinking, and in some sense, maybe just play the game and sprint, and that's fine. But it's also interesting to consider if you're trying to do more like, let's say it's Monday and it's that oblique angle, and that's more like a linear acceleration, to think about how the variations of that could warm someone up for a better acceleration if you did it, like timed it after a few games. Or if you're doing a curvilinear test, if you had games that really, that using that curved route was what helped you win, to use that to warm up, or the deceleration to prep for like a pro agility or whatever. You know what I'm saying? I remember back to it was Rafe Kelly and Charles St. John. They were talking about even just coming up with games, whatever the main skill was that they were teaching. And in this context, it was more like parkour or like those types of things. But there would be games that would lead into that. And so to me, I just think it's really cool to think about the complexity of team sport and all the shapes and the running shapes present. And well, could we use this a little bit? Could we take these constraints of the way that athletes run, and earlier in the summer before things get crazy and more integrated and higher volume, to explore more of maybe the nuances of those things. And I just really like how you laid that out in that manner.
Yeah, we did the way we would have kind of our big general warm up, and then get into some more specific stuff. We'd do some of our plyos, and then some warm up. They were full speed, but warm up sprints. Then we would do our time stuff. Then we would go into games. That was kind of the general flow. But I would definitely be interested to see if we had, if that curve, and even that like curve pursuit drill that we did today, if we had done that before we've timed the flies, like, does that have a difference? Just because not only is it, just variability, but also like they're having a blast.
Yeah.
So, and especially when, the group I have is just the wideouts and the DBs. So I'll line up the matchups, and hey, it's this guy versus this guy. And so it's the dudes they go against every day in practice, whether they're doing, 7-on or 1-on-1 or whatever. So like it gets very competitive. And it's funny too, because a lot of them, they go against each other enough. They know some of the other guys is like movement tendencies. So even within that, it's like, they know, oh, this certain cornerback, he likes to do this, or this certain wideout likes to make this juke move. So they even learn each other's tendencies. It was kind of fun to see across the summer. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if we threw some of that, the kind of quote unquote more fun stuff prior to the pure output stuff, what that would change.
Yeah, it makes me, well, I guess on one sense of things, if you look like the Bondarchuk pyramid of what's the closest to the game, well, the highest transfer is the competitive, game stuff. The the players competing in more specific running patterns to the game of football than simply a linear time sprint. But at the same time, I almost feel like it could be like a little plateau breaker. Like if you felt like people were down, like if they were in yellow or something, and you're like, hey, I still want them to set a PR and feel like mentally keep that train going. Just be like, all right, hey, we're going to do the games first today, and I wonder, I it's kind of like those little things that I think can strategically flip around that can definitely provide those outputs. So because there is a thing too where I do think there can be, maybe there's almost a limit each way that's good. If you always do a particular order one way or the other. Like if we always did games before we did anything else, like games are always the thing we use to fire people up, or we play too many games and not enough, rudimentary. I think there's always a little bit of a gauge sometimes with those things. You can change it up to keep things fresh.
For sure. Yeah. And even part of my thought process too was, especially on like our Wednesdays where the pursuit game stuff was like fairly wide open. I was like, those are probably the environments that they might end up hitting higher speeds in that than they even do in their fly 10 because they're being chased or whatever. So it's like, I want them to be the most ready for that, I guess.
Yeah.
So it was like having everything kind of lead into that. So it's like, hey, you should feel great right now. Let's go for it. that sort of thing.
Yeah, and what I was thinking too, with like my mind with doing a lot of play based training in my own coaching, but then also coaching track and field, and kind of that interplay is, well, yeah, from a readiness, just like a readiness perspective, and if people are getting better, and if it's also a readiness test, yeah, to have a regular sprint first if they're going to go like Justin Lima had talked about the fastest. He gave an example when he was on about how the fastest some player went was faster than any fly 10. It was in pads, and it was coming off of some curvilinear slingshot move, and if you're hitting the highest speed when you're playing, well, don't you want that? Don't you want that anyways? I guess maybe the thing is does the players need to know about it, which I would imagine they would like to. It's like what's mentally the most important to the players to see, I guess maybe could be it as well a little bit, just because like you said, if they are hitting the highest speeds when they're doing the main thing, then that's it. That's what you want anyways. So how do we facilitate that being the best anyways, really?
Yeah, I agree.
So I'm probably getting maybe a little more in the weeds with this than I need to. I did want to mention one thing. This was a question I had. I don't know if I would necessarily, maybe I'm reframing it, but I thought this was interesting. I really like how you had the speed day at linear and then the linear into that short decel. And one, I like how, to me, that seems like a very, I certainly have my opinion about coaching deceleration. I like where it's just the more organic, the better. And that seems like almost the most organic way you could do it. Run really fast and then stop. And it's timed, it's gamified. I would imagine that decel is probably more than what they would even experience in the game in some respects, or maybe they're cutting off of it in the game and they're not totally stopping. I don't know, but it's an interesting way to, I feel like that's a really simple way to develop that skill versus more coached formats.
Yeah. And it's like, I want them, I guess the overall thought process was, how can I push the absolute speed that they're having to stop from? And, it's like quantifying the lead-in is probably the best way to go about it, because even like the gamified stuff, it's rare that in game they're having to go from top speed to a dead stop. It's usually some sort of little maneuverability, or there's some level of like angle to it, and there's, I guess, unless you're like a wideout running a 15-yard comeback, but even that, you're at 15 yards, you're not at top speed, and you're still having to maneuver, stem your route based on the coverage and all that. So like, that's not even achieving the top speed that you would have to decelerate from. So it's definitely like, okay, how can we push that top speed that they have to come down from? Because even in the gamified stuff, if I'm I guess another scenario would be like a DB, if I'm coming downhill to make a tackle, but then the guy breaks another way, and all of a sudden I've got to flip 180 and go chase him. Like, even in that initial lead in, I wasn't at top speed because I'm preparing to potentially tackle him. So I'm a little more under control. So yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be that graded slowdown and the redirection, not necessarily as fast as possible and just stop. But I mean, it's the overload, though. I mean, I feel like if it's off season, you're overloading physical qualities. Like, there's just the same way, like a change of direction or something that's probably more, I guess you just call it canned, right? Like, there's something physical that's being overloaded that's pretty substantial, even if it's not technically or perceptually the same thing that's going to be happening, or exact same thing, I should say. It's in the ballpark.
Yeah, and even a scenario that popped up today, I was doing like a vice drill with the DBs in some of our more, our open stuff. I had just the DBs, and it was, one of them is playing as the wide receiver, and he's getting the ball, and they're all coming in from the same side of the field, essentially. And I'm kind of setting the defenders up for failure, where they're far enough away where it's like, hey, the 15-yard line is the touchdown for the offensive guy. And then, so basically the two defenders have to work to, like, one of them has to haul ass to cross that guy's face to make him change direction, or else he can just go straight for the pylon and get to the corner. And then, but then I moved them back so that the defenders were pretty much set up for failure. But it was interesting to see the guys who were comfortable, like some guy, when you come ready to tackle or tag off, you have to kind of jockey into it a little bit. And the dudes who started jockeying so much earlier, it was the guys who weren't as comfortable, like going. And then, like, if I can keep running full speed up to 3 yards away from you, and then still jockey to put myself in a controlled position to tackle you, I'm eating up more space. And it's like one of the bases of Fergus Connolly talks about it, is just like, if I'm offensive, I want to create space. If you're defensive, you want to close space. So it's like, how close to you can I get as a defender before I have to start jockeying to put myself in a position to tackle you? Like, that could mean, I tackle you 2 to 3 yards earlier, because instead of jockeying 7 yards away from you, I can start jockeying 3 yards away from you and still be under control to tackle you. So I honestly wish I had pushed that distances on that drill a little more, because I pushed it today and saw some of like how dudes changed their distance from the offensive guy jockeying. It was like, but it looked very similar to the Friday. How fast can you run and then be able to stop? So that one is a note for me for next year. Be like, all right, we need to progress that one a little faster. So.
Yeah. Today's podcast is sponsored by Gym Studio. Gym Studio is a frictionless gym and studio management software. It can effortlessly manage memberships, schedule classes, track attendance, and even automate billing. To check out what Gym Studio can do for you, head to gymstudio.com and set up your free 14-day trial in less than 5 minutes. That was actually, with you saying that was actually with the decel thing, what I was going to ask, and you gave an answer with it already, in the sense of how early do you start kind of jockeying and preparing versus can you fearlessly go in there and then make the rapid perceptual decision, and like, can you open and close those feedback loops faster? But this could be a very wide ranging question. There probably isn't an easy answer to this or a singular answer, but the things that, because this is the magic bullet or what, I mean, if there was one, but what things do you see out of the better players on the field in the gamut of drills? Like you said, like the jockeying, the deceleration, angular running. One thing we didn't get into, and I know you've done it, is running with your head, with a head turn, those kind of things. Is there any list of things, or simple games, like a simple game that's pretty easy to describe and execute? Is there any list or generalities that you would say, okay, maybe all these players run the same 20 or 40, but these guys, I see what they're doing in these games, in some of these other types of run constraints, that they simply do better, and I also see how that impacts the field. Is there any list or just considerations that you've gathered with that comparison, or those distinguishing factors?
Yeah. So I mean, you didn't say the word necessarily, but it's kind of like, if the guys all have the same absolute output, who's got the better quote unquote game speed, essentially.
Yeah.
It's a incredibly multifactorial, obviously, but it's the way that I've kind of tried to organize it for our work was looking at, like, obviously there's the least constrained is just like, you have open field, go run. Like, that's the highest output. And then some of them are more offensive and more defensive, but it's how fast can you go when you get to decide the change of direction. So I know I'm a wide receiver, I'm gonna run this 15-yard comeback. How comfortable am I opening up in that 15 yards before I have to break down? How comfortable am I going? This is more defensive when the opponent decides to change the direction. And I've got to react off of that. And so those are the fairly straightforward game type stuff. Is how comfortable am I trying to create space? How comfortable am I trying to close space when I'm in control or when you're in control? And then the other two that I've started playing around with, one we played around with last year, and the other one I started playing around this year was sprinting when you're not looking forward, and sprinting when there's an increased chance of contact.
Mm.
And that was definitely from, there's a Matt Ray put an article, I think it was on LinkedIn or something like that, but it was just a quick thoughts that he put up about game speed. And one of them was about how much we underestimate the impact that the possibility of being decleated like lowers how much your body is willing to open up, essentially. Like if there's an increased chance of falling, I think he used it specifically talking about the increased chance of falling, which that goes into not looking forward. But it's like basically your body is going to regulate you down a certain amount if it thinks you're going to get hit or you're going to fall to the ground. And so how can we desensitize you to those things? And then also, give you physical qualities to help you in those scenarios, but then also just desensitize you to those. So like the quote unquote contact prep work that I would do with the fast guys was more like rolling, interacting with the ground. It was less like I got to move this other human being. It was more, okay, now we're going to jog into this roll a little bit, like get them comfortable. Like, oh, I just fell down. How am I going to fall? Am I going to roll over this shoulder? Or am I going to roll to the side? Like those sorts of things. And then specifically we do it. It was today on our Wednesday. It was, we do before our fly 10 stuff, like as sort of our warm up sprints, we do basically like a 20 plus 20, but it's at like 95%. I'm like, hey, we're opening up, but you don't have to slam on the gas pedal yet. Like it's still getting ramped up. But within those, I have one of our coaches stand on the left sideline at the 20-yard line, and I'm on the right sideline at the 40-yard line. And it's like, all right, for the first 20 yards, you got to find him, and the next 20 yards, you got to find me. And it's just a little thing where it's like, you don't think about it in terms of how much it can lower potential outputs, but that's a special teams. That's a huge area where guys are having to run down the field while scanning to find the guy who's trying to come block them, or vice versa, scanning to try to find the guy that they are assigned to go block. And you're not just getting to look in front of you. And so, or even like the classic example that you see is DB is in phase with a wide out, goes to look up for the ball and immediately slows down. And it's like, is that like just poor anticipation of where the ball is tracking to potentially, or is that your body also just being like, we are no longer looking where we're running and I don't like this, so I'm gonna down regulate you a little bit, even if you don't necessarily realize that's what's happening. So that's when we try to get the guys exposed to, and it's not a ton of our work, it's a couple reps a week, but it's enough where they're like, they have felt at least every week a couple reps of, I'm expected to run full speed right now while looking in a complete different direction than where I'm running. And then the sprinting with an increased chance of contact, that's tougher. That's the one that's a little bit tougher for us to do. You obviously get that when they're just playing ball, because we're not, in the summer, we're not tackling. So it's not that sort of contact. They're not having to worry about collisions necessarily, but they, if two guys go for the ball, they're going to bump into each other. So, and that's contact, even if the defender is not going in with the goal of tackling them, or, but just a little way we've thrown that in, like it was mostly on our Fridays, was, we would just like, hey, some paired up partner races, like real simple, like, hey, pick a partner. We'd do like various start positions, half kneeling, push up, all that. Like, hey, you're racing through 15 yards. But during those reps, I would say you can't hold and you can't tackle. But apart from that, is full contact. So dude's like, all right, I'm lined up. Hey, it's a partner reaction race. The guy in front or the guy behind gets to decide when they're going. And dude's just like hand on hip, shoving dudes as hard as they could. Like, but still with the end goal of you're trying to get through the line first. So you can't just completely abandon running forward and just try to go decleat your guy or whatever. But it was, and they were mature about it. It's like, hey, don't hold, but Sometimes that meant just like, swiping a dude's arm so it
Mhm.
messes up his arm swing and stuff like that. But it's just like basically giving them the freedom, like, hey, you're racing through the 15-yard line. Don't hold, don't tackle. Basically, don't be a dickhead about it. But you guys can shove each other. I don't care. And and there ends up being a handful of good reps where like dudes get bumped in the hip a little bit, and so they're stumbling a little bit and they have to catch themselves. And again, it's not a ton of that type of work, but it's exposing them to a handful of those types of reps where they're it's at least exposing them to it a little bit throughout the summer.
Yeah. As you're talking, it's just, this has definitely been a running theme for me the last several years, in both linear speed training, and Chris Korfist talks about this a lot, like shedding the layers of neuroregulation that an athlete might have. But in sport, it's just shedding fear in sport, and limiting fear of contact. And it's like the more you can be aware of, the faster you can perceive it, and the less you can be afraid, the faster you have capability to move. I think it was as you were talking to, I was thinking about Austin Jochum posted this. I think it was Bijan Robinson with this was like 2020. It's funny because I hadn't even seen this till
Oh, and he
Austin.
lands like on his neck.
Yeah, he lands he does like a scorpion like landing, and some guy hits him right in the middle of the back or something. But leading up to that, though, he tried to walk over the defender. Like he tried to step on him and jump over him. But to just get in, and yes, it didn't end well for him. But the thing is he had the guts to even try it. It's like there was no limiters holding that guy back. And it makes me think about the research that's shown that the more free play you have in your sport and your movement when you're young, that compounds itself later on. And you think about free play and think about kids, like rough and tumble free play, and your drill you were mentioning with the chase and that you can initiate contact. It's a combination of a drill or a timing system that's usually used for older athletes, combined with some roughhousing that you would do when you were a kid. It's like this blend of two worlds. I'm sure there's a lot of people laughing and smiling during that too, and I'm sure it's a great time.
And so there's two things that one scenario that actually got me thinking about, it was right after I read the Ray article talking about fear of falling as a limiter. So I'm a big NBA basketball fan, and right around that time when I was planning out the summer, Darius Garland, he's a guard on the Cleveland Cavaliers, and he early in the season he took a hard elbow. I forget exactly what it was, but had a fracture in his jaw and missed 8 weeks, whatever it was. But some of the some of the NBA reporters that I listened to the podcast, like Bill Simmons, Ryan Russillo, they were talking about when he came back, he just wasn't the same player because so much of his game was just downhill, going to the hoop.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get fouled to go to the free throw line. But he's coming off a broken jaw, and he was clearly hesitant in doing some of that stuff. And so just a quick example of you talk about oh, he's clear, he's healthy, he's back. And it's yeah, but is he willing to just throw his body back into these 7-footers when he's coming off a broken jaw, even though the doctor can tell him it's fully healed? He's clearly not comfortable doing that. You could see it just his free throw rate went down because he wasn't going into the lane as hard and that sort of stuff. That, and then what you just said about kids rolling around all the time. I was on a walk. It was yesterday with my wife and our dog and baby. And there was a 10-year-old kid across the street riding the bike with their mom. And they caught the edge of the curb or something like that and completely bailed off their bike. And there was the 2 seconds of and then they hopped up and they got back on their bike and they kept going. And my wife commented, if either one of us did that, we'd be in the hospital.
Yeah.
And we're both strength coaches, stay active, stay fit, we're running around, all that. And she was like, and I haven't fallen like that in forever because, we're not, we train a lot, but I'm not out playing pickup basketball or, that sort of stuff. She's like, man, if I fell like that, I'd be in a body bag. And I was like, but this 10-year-old kid was just oh, all right, back on my bike. And it's so if you're used to it, kids are used to just going around and falling off the monkey bars or a lot more than, us domesticated adults.
Yeah. Yeah. I always think too, when I think about rough and tumble play, I always tackle basketball. Jeremy Frisch like talks about growing up playing tackle basketball or something like that. I'm
Yeah.
like, man, can you think of if you're talking about anticipating contact and trying to not fear contact and yet still doing high skill output activity?
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. I think that's just where so much fun can be had. I don't think you could, I don't know, tackle basketball for a football team might not be the best. I like your, race and contact, don't tackle.
Yeah, yeah.
That seems like a good place to start. Maybe it could lead to tackle basketball. I don't know. I'm sure they'd probably have fun doing it, but
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about all those layers that do make for, that, and like you said, it's complex. Like there's probably so many things, even to like perception. Like, what is it that helps an athlete to perceive that thing earlier? Someone, I think I think he's a PhD. It's like, gear. I cannot. It's like Jorday or JORDT. I think that's it. I had written him down. He had like thing on why Messi is one of the reasons Messi is as good as he is, and he showed the amount of times Messi scans the field. Like it's like double the rate of other players. Like how fast he's scanning with his eyes to perceive the landscape. And sometimes I wonder too, I think there is like that complex free play, just learning to take in information faster. There's also innate gifts and talents in there, clearly. And I also do wonder if there's visual hardware in cases, or even like reactivity. And that's probably where, again, it gets very complex and what makes us each who we are. But I think the easiest place to take that on is just from the complex, the free play, the rough and tumble, those elements, and seeing how players navigate that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, hey, last question I had for you here. And I remembered something you said the first podcast we did. It was with you and Andrew. And you had said something about like conditioning. And I think it was to the tune of if all you did was small-sided games and played the game itself, like optimally that would be the conditioning. I'm curious if that's what you're doing right now, if there's any extra runs or work on top of the games and play and speed work you're already doing. Any final take on that as our final question here?
I mean, I definitely look at it as like the summer, I'm trying to build. The ultimate goal stays the same from like what I was even talking about in that podcast is we need to physically set these guys up to play as much football as they possibly can prior to our first game, while still being moderately fresh and ideally fully healthy. Because it's like, football is incredibly technically, tactically complex. Our offensive coordinator wants as many reps as possible, and he should get those. He should take those. Our defense coordinator, the same. Like, if we can do, just throwing out round numbers, if we can do 100 reps of team over X amount of time and still be fully fresh and healthy as a team, if we only do 80, we just missed out on 20 reps while not necessarily gaining anything in terms of freshness and healthiness. So it's like, I'm looking at it as in the summer, how can I build our tank so high that we can offer when we're talking about fall camp, when we're looking at practice scripts, I want to almost be in a position where I can go, hey, based on what we did this summer, like we can do a little more here, we can push it here. That's the goal for me, is because in being in the kind of sports science roles that I've been in at various schools and with different head coaches, you never want to be the guy who's always like, oh, we should do less today, or like, man, we really did a lot yesterday. It's like part of that comes from what did you build up to in the summer, and then what did you build up to in the summer? How can you undulate days to get more out of it, and that sort of thing. But I think the broader answer is yes. I would ideally, you don't do, the way to get ready for the game is to play the game as much as possible. There are certainly logistical constraints to that sometimes, where and logistical constraints and potential health constraints, because we play a collision sport, that you're just anytime you line up and go play live football, there is just unmitigatable risk of dude falls over into your ankle and cracks your fibula, or and so you do want to avoid, like, push the limit of that during the non-competitive time of the year, the summer for us. Try to push as much of that type of work as possible while being, aware of the potential just bad luck collision scenarios and trying to mitigate those as much as we can. And then, the same way in fall camp, we limit the amount of time that we're just like truly live tackling. But so I would say the goal is still the same. Like, if we can get all of our quote unquote conditioning from playing ball, let's do that. And but that isn't necessarily in the summer, with our constraints in terms of how much we can be playing football. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
To get up to the volumes that we need. So, like I talked about on our Tuesday, Thursdays, it was, hey, this is how much allowable football time we have. We're going to do that. And then, hey, we need X amount of yardage and change the direction and acceleration load type work. Okay, we're going to do that at the end as well. But we have to put the footballs away and that sort of thing. So part of it ends up being logistical. But even too, like, football is a tough one. I think I might have even been talking more specifically in the context of lacrosse on that one, is because it's, women's lacrosse is still collision, or it's a contact sport, not a collision sport. And so, but football is such high collision that maybe you'd want to mitigate that with just some general work to build the volume. But I mean, the big goal is still, I always go back to, is how can we play as much full speed, game speed football as possible while still being fresh and fast for that first game. And, the key is full speed, game speed type of work. So you have to undulate days with environments so that they're set up to actually perform, instead of, oh, it's our 5th day in a row and we've just been dogging them. And, the outputs are, especially with some offenses, how timing is so important of, hey, is this guy at 12 yards or is he at 13 yards in terms of when he comes out of his break? If his CNS is in the doghouse, that doesn't end up being full speed. So, setting them up from a summer build standpoint, and then setting them up from an acute, like, daily undulation, weekly undulation standpoint during fall camp, to just get as many full speed game reps as possible. It ends up being a little bit anti feed the cats in terms of like, okay, what's the least amount of technical tactical work that we can do to push the needle on that side? I look at it as like, what's the most technical tactical work that we can do while still being relatively fresh and healthy. Especially too, like, the way the game weeks end up lining up. Like, we're smart about those first 2.5 weeks of camp. Like, we push it, but then taper it down into our first game week. So, and lucky to have, head coach and coordinators who are on board with that. And, but that's another area where, for me personally, like, knowing, okay, we'll be able to push it in fall camp, like being directly involved in the fall camp planning and then directly involved in the building of the summer. It's like, if it's messed up, like, there's nobody else to blame. I can't be like, well, I built them up in the summer, but then the fall camp was just crazy. We couldn't account for it, because it's like, no, I helped plan both of them. So, and all of us sat down and talked about all of it. So, and then vice versa, it could be like, oh, I didn't build up in the summer enough because I didn't quite know what fall camp was going to be. It's like, no, we knew exactly what fall camp was going to be. So you know what you need to get to, you can go get there and go from there. But a long way to say, yeah, ideally it's as much game as possible. But in a collision sport, sometimes you got to mitigate the collision environments you put them in as much as you can, just from a flying bullet standpoint of, oh, some dude rolled up onto your ankle or whatever. But then even too, just from like, do we want to, from a big boy in the trenches standpoint, it's like, they're smacking each other's heads a bunch. Do we?
Yeah.
we should maybe treat that as a factor as well. So, but
Of course. Yeah. It's back to like athletes can handle a lot, but then for how long? And of course, if it's the whole year and they're doing that all year, like then the risk of things going wrong, or finding different ways to do it, I suppose, with less collision, or like logistically, needing to do just more standard work periodically certainly makes sense in light of a collision sport, without question.
Yeah, and even in fall camp too. It's like, I know I saw the Panthers staff. This is a year and a half ago, something like that. Saw Althoff and Belarus and Barbo talk about like some of the heuristics they use around loading. And one of Althoff's is just like, it was like his rule of three. I think it was not on the field for more than 3 hours. Don't practice more than 3 days in a row. And then like every three-ish weeks, they got to be down a little bit. And it's like, that's one of the things we talked about when planning our fall camp is like, if we just keep everything, if we don't expect them to go full speed more than 3 days in a row, that is going to handle a lot of our, that's going to get, from an 80-20 standpoint, that's going to handle a lot.
Yeah.
So it's like being smart there, and having some sort of undulation in terms of total length of practice and environments that they're seeing on those practices, whenever you're doing the special teams, that sort of stuff. But if you do that, like, it doesn't take some crazy dashboard or whatever to kind of predict what's it going to look like. It's like, we're just generally smart with setting these guys up for success in fall camp. They're going to be okay because we built them up during the summer. And if you all of a sudden come out and it's like, hey, NCAA allows it, so we're going to practice 6 days in a row and then have a day off. It's like, okay, is that going to go great though? Like, I don't know. So it's just being generally common sense filled around planning out fall camp, and then building up to it because what's coming. So
the controlled burn. I like the 3 threes too. Good things definitely come in threes, so it's easy to remember as well. So it definitely makes
and when
sense.
He said it, I was like, that makes less sense.
Yeah, I've seen that in track too. Like, I've seen cycles, track setups where it's like Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are all kind of tough, but then you can't keep doing. I'm sure anyone who's done that aggressive of a cycle early in the week knows you can't. If you try to do something hard on that fourth day, it's not going to be very good. So, anyways, well, hey, Joel, it was awesome talking to you. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was really cool hearing what you're up to, man. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode. I appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next week.